these spaces were spaces where buildings had crumbled down, and they were rubble heaps, filled with tires and dirty syringes and whatever else. And Liz Christie and a generation of community activists said, let's clean these spaces up. Let's beautify these spaces. Let's green these spaces. And they became, we just talked about a union meeting hall, they became a public commons for people to meet. We're talking about Neil Smith here, we're talking about gentrification on this tour. One of the ironies of the community gardens is that once the gardens started being proliferated around the Lower East Side, there are more community gardens in the Lower East Side than any other neighborhood in the United States. When the gardens start to be proliferated, you get good things that Jane Jacobs talks about, right? You have the eyes on the streets. You have an intergenerational space where people can meet up. I mean, the Starbucks, not everybody wants to meet into a Starbucks or go to a pub. You're not going to meet with your grandmom at a pub maybe, but you might feel perfectly relaxed hanging out in a community garden with grandchildren, a parent, and their grandparents in one space. It's an intergenerational space, interracial space where lots of different kinds of folks have a different kind of community they build. A lot of the Puerto Ricans in the neighborhood have been leaders in the community garden movement. And so, ironically, when Giuliani was coming into power, these spaces had helped contribute to the gentrification of the neighborhood because they increased property values. They reduced crime, which is, these are good things to reduce crime and to reduce asthma in a neighborhood and have a public commons, a public meeting place. When I got involved in organizing in the late 90s, there was a group called the Lower East Side Collective. We would meet back here and plan direct action to defend the community gardens. There was a woman in this garden named Francoise Catalan, and she was an organizer who was involved with the French resistance, against the Nazis. So her last radical thing she was involved with was community gardening, because she realized the radical power of people getting together and building an open community space that anybody could have access to. The police, whenever we would get arrested for the gardening action, she'd show up and the police would always let her go in there, and she'd be like, I hate to all these cops around here. But, so when the war was about to start, she had a big chant, and we might want to do it in honor of her, but her chant was, and part of my French is terrible, but it's, Toutes alors, we all hate these stinking wars. Toutes alors, we all hate these stinking wars. Toutes alors, we all hate these stinking wars. Okay, Francoise, this is for you. She was also the leader of the Gardner Bulldozer Support List. So anytime the city would try and go and bulldoze a community garden, they would start the phone list, the phone tree. And of course, that's how we often defended the community gardens or the squats, because you'd hear the police were coming after one squat or one community garden, and we would defend it. She was around when the city started to auction off community gardens in the late 90s, and the Shar El Bahio Community Services Center. She organized with Lower East Side Collective and helped lay the groundwork for the Spitzer Agreement, which was an agreement which we helped win after a group of us were arrested 13 years ago, this February 15th, which is also the day of the biggest world protest in world history for the anti-war movement 3 years later. But when we all got arrested, Elliot Spitzer realized we have to work this out. We cannot keep on kicking people out of these beloved community gardens in the Lower East Side. So they established an 8-year agreement to preserve the gardens that was established from 2002 to 2010. And in 2010, we had to use direct action to preserve the community gardens again. But there was, for many, many years in this neighborhood, and you probably know more about this, Eddie Burros put together 40 feet pyramid, structure made of
everything,
all sorts of found objects from the neighborhood that used to stand right here in the corner of this garden. And it was very much a sort of public art monument, an idea that anybody could contribute to this piece of art. It was very democratic. I have a great memory about this. I was walking along by the garden 10 years ago. My daughter was first born, and she was, of course, walking on the sidewalk and fell down and scraped her knee, and she was crying and crying. And then we walked over and we looked, and they said, Dodie, look, a baby was hanging, like a doll was hanging in the tree, and she smiled. So art actually can make our lives much better every single day. I got to tell you, I'm forever grateful to this garden for those little moments. But there are turtles down here. There are places to hang out, and we talk about greening, greenwashing. There's parts of green space as a sort of corporate strategy. But this, on the other hand, is, I think, an authentic form of community organizing, a space where people can meet and hang out and defend their space. and defend, and also create a public commons. We were just talking a little bit about uses of defense for the community gardens. I mean, when the city first wanted to bulldoze the community gardens, they would sell off these gardens in land auctions, and they wouldn't say this is the 6th Street and Avenue B community garden. They would say this is lot whatever, whatever, whatever. And so at one of these auctions, when they tried to sell the Shire Salvajio Community Services Center as well as several of the gardens, Leslie Kaufman, Francois, Ron Haydock, and Seth the Boatman and some wonderful community activists showed up pre-9/11 with crickets in envelopes. They walked into the meeting, and it goes through the security thing, and there's no metal, so you can carry an envelope in there. And these scruffy activists all wearing like suits, and this wasn't like suits that looks money, you know. Like there were a lot of developers there in a polo shirt and jeans. But Seth the Boatman with his suit like up to here, like hanging off, Sears and Roebuck, not looking money, but trying to do false bidding. So they did false bidding on the gardens for a while, and it was like $1.2 million, $1.3 million for a community garden. Anyway, Leslie Kaufman, finally they were like, do you have any money for this? And she took out her Metro card, and she said, I've got $2 left from the Metro card. But so anyway, at a certain point when they got to the right bidding moment, they started releasing these crickets. And when they released the crickets, it was like, remember the shampoo ad when you put your finger like in the shampoo and it would all spread out on the page? Like everybody ran, okay? It was a panic pandemonium moment, but at that point, there were so many community members that were so sympathetic. Giuliani had gotten his way for 4 years in New York City, but by 1998, people were sick and tired of his narrative, which is either you're a friend of decay, you're a degenerate if you're opposed to my development program. And this is the first time I think that community activists really won, and the city started saying, you know what, Giuliani, you're crazy. You know, it was just the beginning of people saying, we've got to have another way of living in a city where we can't have community gardens. So, when we talk about organizing around creating public space, the Zuccotti Park moment, the global justice movement, which is a sort of do-it-yourself movement to reclaim public space, I think the gardens was really one of the first manifestations of that. The second Reclaim the Streets action actually took place on Avenue A, where we put up a tripod and said, reclaim the streets to preserve a community garden. Anyway, thank you guys for letting me talk. I really appreciate it.
What
Yes.
happened to the tower?
What happened to the tower?
Why was it big?
Right after he died, and I think it was 2006 he died.
It was a year after he
Yeah,
died.
it started to become a point where it's like one thing to do a do-it-yourself art project.
It was going to fall.
It was going to fall over. So, but I mean, if he was still alive, it would still be there. And I think the people in the garden loved it. I don't think it was. It's like it was a wonderful installation for many, many, many years. I also, before I stop, I want to point out the Green Thumb program started by Ed Koch in 1998 preserves some of the community gardens in New York City, but there are many community gardens that are not preserved. The creative the Church's Magical Garden on Stanton Street is not preserved. So they're part of housing preservation development. They could be bulldozed at any point. So the garden movement isn't over. And we're also creating more gardens. There's a new website called 496 Acres, which lists 496 acres of vacant lots in New York City, which, if they're on your block, you should put up a sign on the space that says, wouldn't this vacant lot be better to turn into a community garden? Some activists on 118 Stanton Street recently opened up the fence in a community garden and a vacant lot on Stanton Street, and I went in with my kids and a bunch of members of the community. We went in, cleaned up some bricks out, and started creating a garden right there. And the community board recently approved it because they like the idea of us creating more gardens. So, anybody, you want to join a garden? You could call. I mean, it's not open now, and that's one of the challenges is trying to have more volunteers to keep the gardens more open. But the beauty of the garden movement is it's the closest thing I've ever seen to democracy. It's not perfect because gentrification means some of the original gardeners have been pushed out of the neighborhood. And so they have people who maybe have less of an attitude that this is a democracy space. They may have an attitude that the homeless shouldn't hang out in a community garden because it threatens kids. Well, I have kids. I'm more threatened by a city that's so bland and gentrified that it's scary. I would rather have a garden be open to everybody, the 1%. And the 99% means everybody, including the homeless, including everybody. So the politics of gardening is still a politics of land use, but it's a very democratic movement, and anybody that wants to join a garden can join. just call up their website and you could join. I suggest anybody that really cares about neighborhood issues in New York, find a garden near your house. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.